Ha, hakikaten oluyor ha. Oluyor oluyor. Sen soracaksın.
They asked you to keep it, okay, okay. But even I know, well, I think when everyone has, yeah, you too. If we get questions, we'll move back to the mic. They don't do the boom anymore.
Oh, okay. So we move back?
No, if you get a question, you
Go down.
Go down.
I had back surgery recently. How can I do that?
And if you get a question, then we'll both move back.
Okay. Hi, how are you?
Hi.
Good afternoon, and thank you for being here today. Israel's Foreign Minister Gideon Sa'ar called for an urgent UN Security Council session after we saw the horrific footage last week of hostages Eviatar David and Rom Braslevsky in terrible conditions. Innocent souls who remain in Hamas terror tunnels. We will not allow them to be forgotten. We are honored to be joined today by Foreign Minister Sa'ar, who will deliver a statement here before addressing the Security Council.
Good afternoon. I came to the United Nations today because our hostages are still being starved and tortured by Hamas and Islamic Jihad in the dungeons of Gaza. I came here to put the issue of the hostages front and center on world stage. They cannot be forgotten. I came to call for the immediate and unconditional release of our hostages. On October 7th, Hamas committed evil crimes like the Nazis and ISIS did. They took 251 hostages into cruel captivity. 50 of them are still there. This past weekend, the world witnessed the cruel starvation of Eviatar David and Rom Braslevsky, tortured deliberately by Hamas and Islamic Jihad. The world saw their terrible condition, bones standing out in their skin like living skeletons. Eviatar was forced to dig his own grave. This is satanic. Hamas and Islamic Jihad used the starvation and torture as part of a deliberate and well-planned sadistic propaganda campaign. But the truth must be told. Israel facilitating huge amounts of aid into Gaza. No other country acts this way in war under such difficult circumstances. The world has been turned upside down. There are countries that acted also in this building to pressure Israel instead of Hamas during sensitive days in the negotiations by attacking Israel, campaigning against Israel, and their announcement on a recognition of the virtual Palestinian state. They gave Hamas free gifts and an incentive to continue this war. They directly assassinated the hostage deal and ceasefire. Let me be clear, these countries prolonged the war. Hamas is responsible for beginning this war by invading Israel and committing the October 7th atrocities. Hamas is also responsible for the continuation of this war by still refusing to release our hostages and lay down its arms. The international pressure must be on Hamas. Anything else only prolongs this war. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Is Israel planning to reoccupy Gaza?
It was a good try. It was a good try.
Declaro abierta.
The 9,972nd meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Argentina and Israel to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. On behalf of the Council, I welcome His Excellency Mr. Gideon Sa'ar, Minister for Foreign Affairs of the State of Israel. I propose that the Council invite the representative of the observer state of Palestine to the United Nations to participate in the meeting in accordance with the Provisional Rules of Procedure and the previous practice in this regard. There being no objection, it is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Mr. Miroslav Yencha, Assistant Secretary General for Europe, Central Asia and Americas, Departments of Political and Peace-Building Affairs and Peace Operations, and Mr. Eli David. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Mr. Miroslav Yencha.
Mr. President, Excellencies, the situation in the occupied Palestinian territory and Israel continues to deteriorate, with Palestinian and Israeli civilians, including the remaining hostages in Gaza, continuing to suffer immensely as a result. In the past week, Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad released images and videos of 2 hostages, Evitar David and Rom Braslavsky, looking visibly emaciated as they described the appalling conditions of their captivity. The scenes of Evitar apparently being forced to dig his own grave are appalling. These images and their own accounts of their treatment have horrified us all. They are an affront to humanity itself. I would like to acknowledge the presence of Eli David, the brother of Evitar David, who we will hear from shortly. Mr. David, please know that we at the United Nations recognize the profound pain and hardship endured by the families and loved ones of those who remain in captivity. Nearly 2 years have passed, with the immeasurable suffering and fear intensifying with every passing day. I am especially mindful that this week the Jewish community commemorated Tisha B'Av, a day of mourning and remembrance of historical tragedies endured by the Jewish people, a time that echoes with the pain of loss across generations. I pay tribute to your courage and determination, and I share your dearest wish for your brother and all hostages held in Gaza to be immediately and unconditionally released. Mr. President, Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups continue to hold 50 hostages, 28 of whom are thought to be deceased, in captivity in horrific conditions. Released hostages have relayed distressing accounts of deprivation, ill treatment, and abuse. Since 7 October 2023, Hamas and other armed groups have circulated dozens of videos of hostages, including statements made by hostages under duress and clearly suffering, including the most recent footage of Evaitar David and Rom Braslavsky. International law is clear. Hostage-taking is prohibited. It is a war crime. Those deprived of liberty must be treated humanly and with dignity and allowed to receive visits from the International Committee of the Red Cross. They must never be subject to ill treatment, abuse, or humiliation, as this would also constitute violations of relevant rules of international law. I reiterate the Secretary General's call on Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. They must be freed now. Mr. President, the situation in Gaza is horrifying. It is unbearable. Palestinians are subjected to squalid, inhuman conditions on a daily basis. Since the beginning of the conflict, over 60,000 Palestinians have been killed, according to the Gaza Ministry of Health. Since the end of May, over 1,200 Palestinians have been killed and over 8,100 injured while trying to access food supplies, including in the vicinity of militarized aid distribution sites. The deaths and injuries continue to mount day by day, with no end in sight to the suffering. Israel continues to severely restrict humanitarian assistance entering Gaza, and the aid that is permitted to enter is grossly inadequate. Hunger is everywhere in Gaza, visible in the faces of children and in the desperation of parents risking their lives to access the most basic supplies. I would like to echo the Secretary General's condemnation of the ongoing violence in Gaza, including the shooting, killing, and injuring of people attempting to get food for their families. International law is clear. Civilians must be respected, protected, and never targeted, or deliberately deprived of food or access to other life-saving aid. Doing so is a war crime. Israel must immediately allow and facilitate a rapid and unimpeded passage of sufficient amounts of humanitarian relief for civilians in need to avert further suffering and loss of life. Mr. President, the latest reports regarding Prime Minister Netanyahu's possible decision to expand Israel's military operations through the entire Gaza Strip, if true, are deeply alarming. This would risk catastrophic consequences for millions of Palestinians and could further endanger the lives of the remaining hostages in Gaza. International law is clear in this regard. Gaza is and must remain an integral part of a future Palestinian state. As declared by the International Court of Justice in its advisory opinion of 19 July 2024, the State of Israel is under an obligation to cease immediately all new settlement activities and to evacuate all settlers from the occupied Palestinian territory and to bring to an end its unlawful presence in the occupied Palestinian territory, Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, as rapidly as possible. Mr. President, the United Nations has been clear. There is only one path to ending the ongoing violence and humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza: a full and permanent ceasefire, the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. Life-saving humanitarian aid must flow into Gaza at scale and without obstructions, and civilians must be guaranteed safe, unhindered access to assistance. There is no military solution to the conflict in Gaza or the broader Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We must establish political and security frameworks that can relieve the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, start early recovery and reconstruction, address the legitimate security concerns of Israelis and Palestinians, and secure an end to Israel's unlawful occupation and achieve a sustainable two-state solution, Israel and a fully independent, democratic, contiguous, viable, and sovereign Palestinian state, of which Gaza is an integral part, living side by side in peace and security within secure and recognized borders on the basis of the pre-1967 lines, with Jerusalem as the capital of both states. Thank you.
Agradezco.
I thank Mr. Yencher for his briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Eli David.
Doy la palabra, señor.
I give the floor to Mr. Eli David.
Mr. President, members of the Security Council, distinguished delegates, my name is Eli David, and I am speaking before you today not as a politician or a diplomat, but as a brother. My younger brother, Eviatar David, along with Guy Gilboa Dalal and 48 other hostages, are being held hostage by Hamas in Gaza. Eviatar is the kindest person I know. I learned from him how to be a better son. He is shy, but full of life. He has the soul of a musician. He has played the guitar since he was 10, and we play together every week. I miss his smile, and I miss his hug, and I just want to see him hug my parents. Eviatar was kidnapped from the Nova Music Festival. At the age of 22, he went there to celebrate life, to dance, to enjoy the music he loves. Music is a very big part of who he is. Since that day, my brother and the other hostages have endured an unimaginable nightmare. This is not just a figure of speech. Their lives are truly hanging by a thread. We now know from medical reports and other indications that Eviatar, Guy, and the others are the brink of death. They may only have days left to live. Days. That is how urgent that is. They have each lost nearly half of their body weight. My little brother now weighs only around 40 kilograms. That's just around 90 pounds. Please see this picture of me and my siblings. This is me right here. This is me. My younger sister. This is Eviatar. Look at his smile. The world has heard about the atrocities of Hamas, of October 7th, and in the 22 months since. But what is happening to Eviatar and Guy is an act of calculated and depraved cruelty that defies human comprehension. We have heard the testimonies from those who were released from Hamas tunnels. And every account makes our fears worse. When your brother, your son, your father, your partner is being held in Gaza, there is never good news. The only thing you can hold on to is that they might still be alive. But even that hope is fading, because the truth is, we don't know how much time they have left. 5 months ago, on February 22nd, we received what we thought at the time was the cruelest possible emotional torment to Eviatar. In February, after 500 days in captivity, Hamas broadcasted Eviatar and Guy. They were brought out of the tunnels. Hamas forced them to watch their fellow captives being released. Then, Eviatar and Guy were sent back into the dark tunnels. You could see clearly Guy here, right here, and this is Eviatar. We thought at the time that this was the pinnacle of evil. But then, just this past weekend, we received a new video from hell. We were reminded just how much more cruel and inhumane Hamas and its sick partners are. My brother was a living skeleton. He had barely the strength to move or speak. His voice barely recognizable. In that video, my little brother was forced to speak to the world and then actively began to dig his own grave inside a filthy, dark tunnel in Gaza. My mother and I could not even bring ourselves to watch it. We knew that if we did, we would be unable to function. My father and sister, however, felt they had to see him, to hear his voice, to feel him somehow. Now those images haunt them. My father cannot sleep, and my mother has not stopped crying ever since. What would you do if, God forbid, it was your son, brother, partner, father? We are here because we and the other hostage families cannot wait any longer. We need to reunite with them, to hug them, and to feel them close. There are still fathers whose children are waiting for their return. We are all waiting for everyone's return. For us, the mission is very clear and urgent. We must save Eviatar's life and the life of his friend Guy. We must ensure that all hostages are being released immediately and unconditionally. We don't have more time. They don't have more time. And every minute counts. The last video also exposed another horrifying truth. As my younger brother, a living skeleton, was forced to speak and dig his future grave, you can see the chubby and well-fed hand of Hamas terrorists enter into the frame. This is the hand of his captor, and this is my brother. You can see the hand is even thicker than his leg, than my brother's leg. Suddenly, Hamas confirmed what we have known for months. The terrorists have plenty of food. The only ones starving in Hamas tunnels are the hostages, my brother, Guy, and the 48 others. According to testimonies, we know that the terrorists are in a room nearby, not in the filthy dungeon where Eviatar and Guy are held. They are choosing to starve them as part of a sick and twisted propaganda campaign. They use them and starve them as a weapon of war. Survivors of captivity, including Tal Shoham and Omer Venkert, were held in the same space with my brother Eviatar and his friend Guy, testified to this. They told us that the terrorists always had plenty of food nearby and would even relish it loudly, while the hostages had none. It is all part of a calculated plan to torture the hostages, starve them, break their spirit, both psychologically and physically. This is a humanitarian crisis, the one of the hostages that is being discussed here. Not here in the Security Council, and not in the other UN forums. The very soul of humanity is being scarred by Hamas's barbaric actions. We, the family of Eviatar, refuse to give up hope. We are weeping and suffering, but we are also fighting with every fiber of our being. We will not give up until we see him back home, until my mother and father can hug him again. I'm here to make a direct and urgent call to this esteemed body. First, we must demand the immediate unconditional release of Eviatar David, Guy Gilboa Dalal, and all the other hostages, living and deceased. Not only demand, but put every leverage we can to do so. The time for the immediate action. Eviatar Guy, and the very least 18 other hostages are still alive. After 660 days, they have somehow managed to survive. And we call on you to rescue them from Hamas dungeons underground. Second, we must call for humanitarian aid to reach the hostages. While aid flows into Gaza to help the population, the hostages are being denied even the most basic necessities of life. They haven't received a shred of humanitarian aid since they were captive. This is a flagrant violation of international law. And third, we must recognize that this is a matter of life and death, requiring urgent medical intervention. Eviatar and Guy need immediate access to proper food and life-saving medical care. Every moment of delay is a step closer to a final tragic outcome. We all have responsibility. To the leaders of the world, to every member of this council, and to the global community, your silence is the face of this monstrous cruelty, is complicity. I urge you, do not let them die. We don't have time. Do not let them spend another minute in darkness, suffering beyond imagination. While we do our part, demanding from the Israeli government to do everything to save the hostages, all leaders should unite to pressure Hamas and its partners. Act now before it's too late. Save Eviatar David. Bring my little brother home. Thank you.
Agradezco.
I thank Mr. David for his briefing. I will now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of Denmark.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. David, I want to thank you for your powerful and courageous testimony today. On behalf of Denmark, I wish to convey our deepest sympathies. What you and your family continue to endure is unimaginable. Your presence here today not only honors your loved one, but also sheds light on the profound human toll of this conflict. I would also like to extend my appreciation to Assistant Secretary Jenska for your briefing, and I welcome His Excellency Foreign Minister Saar, as well as the permanent representative of the Observer State of Palestine, to this meeting. Denmark expresses its sincere solidarity with the remaining 50 hostages who've been held captivity for 669 days. 669 days of waking nightmare, as you said it, Mr. David, deprived of their freedom and dignity, and used as human bargaining chips by Hamas. The recent images showing Rom Blaslavsky and Eviatar David in inhumane states are enormously distressing and should be utterly condemned. We regret that the hostages have not been granted any humanitarian access to address their medical and other humanitarian needs as required under international law. Our thoughts are with them and their families. We re-emphasize that hostage-taking is a war crime, and we reiterate our demand for the immediate, unconditional, safe, and dignified release of all remaining hostages. Mr. President, Denmark firmly condemns the heinous terrorist attacks on October 7 perpetrated by Hamas. The attack resulted in the deliberate targeting of civilians, the killing of over 1,200 people, and the abduction of more than 200 individuals, including women and children. Israel has every right to respond to such a brutal and barbaric attack. However, Israel's response must be exercised in compliance with international law and with full respect for international humanitarian law. This includes the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution, which are fundamental to protecting civilian lives. The fight against terrorism cannot come at the expense of the rules that safeguard our shared humanity. Denmark reiterates that any attempt by Israel to annex Palestinian land would be unacceptable and violate international law. What we're witnessing in Gaza is a catastrophic humanitarian situation that is unparalleled in its deprivation of basic human needs and attacks on civilians, civilian infrastructure, and humanitarian personnel. As we've heard from Assistant Secretary General Yencha, more than 60,000 Palestinians have been killed and over 140,000 have been injured. IPC's recent report on food security warns us that the worst-case scenario is unfolding as we speak. Access to food and other essential items and services have plummeted to unprecedented levels, and Gaza is on the brink of a full-scale famine. Civilians are starving, not due to a lack of food, but due to decisions taken by Israel. We cannot continue to let this happen. International law is clear. Humanitarian aid should never be used as a bargaining chip or a political tool. Israel must immediately lift all restrictions to allow for the provision of safe, sustained, and unhindered humanitarian access in line with its obligation under international humanitarian law. Mr. President, the suffering has to end. We call for an immediate end to the war in Gaza through an immediate and permanent ceasefire, unrestricted access for humanitarian aid, and the unconditional and immediate release of all hostages. A permanent ceasefire will lay the foundations to help unravel this nightmare unfolding before our eyes, for recovery, for the civilians trapped in this conflict, for the two-state solution to once again take center stage, and for the prospects of peace. These were also the messages that we heard during the high-level conference on the implementation of the two-state solution last week, where Denmark joined the vast majority of member states in voicing our steadfast support to a two-state solution. There is no better path to ending this conflict than two states, side by side, providing just and lasting peace for all, Israelis and Palestinians alike. For that to happen, the violence in Gaza must stop now. I thank you.
Agradezco.
I thank the representative of Denmark for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of China.
President, I thank ASG Yencha for his briefing. I welcome the participation of Foreign Minister of Israel and delegates from Palestine and Argentina in this meeting. I also thank Mr. David for his statement and express my deep sympathy for the suffering your loved ones have endured. We sincerely hope that all surviving hostages will be treated humanely, released at an early date, and reunited with their families without delay. We hope that the trauma caused by this tragedy will be alleviated and healed at an early date. President, the conflict in Gaza has dragged on for almost 2 years, causing unprecedented death and destruction, and bringing unimaginable suffering to civilians in both Palestine and Israel. The ceasefire agreement reached in January this year, if fully implemented, could have paved the way for a lasting ceasefire in Gaza and the return of all hostages to their families. Regrettably, however, the ceasefire has been broken. Hostages remain in captivity, and the suffering continues. We call for an immediate and lasting ceasefire. Israel's military operations have resulted in the deaths of over 60,000 civilians in Gaza, with innocent lives still being lost every day. The harsh reality has shown that military means are not the solution. An immediate ceasefire is the right path to saving lives and bringing hostages home. Recent media reports indicate that Israel has decided to escalate its military offensive and fully occupy Gaza. We express our grave concern of this development. We urge Israel to immediately halt such dangerous actions. We also urge all parties to promptly reach a binding and sustainable ceasefire agreement, and urge countries with significant influence over the parties concerned to act in a just and responsible manner and take concrete steps to help bring about a ceasefire. We call for alleviating the humanitarian catastrophe. The 2 million innocent civilians in Gaza should not be victims of war, nor should they endure further suffering from man-made disasters. Under the current extreme blockade and siege, the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza continues to worsen, with severe famine looming large. Restricting humanitarian access will only further exacerbate the collective punishment of people in Gaza and make it harder for surviving hostages to access life-saving supplies. Israel must comply with international law, especially the IHL, fully restore humanitarian access, and support humanitarian agencies such as the United Nations in delivering aid. We call for revitalizing the two-state solution. The decades-long cycle of conflict between Palestine and Israel has cast a shadow of generations on both sides. Fully implementing the two-state solution and achieving an independent Palestinian state is the only viable path to resolving the Palestinian question and preventing recurrence of similar hostage crises. Last week's high-level international conference sent a strong signal in support of implementing the two-state solution. The international community should jointly oppose unilateral actions that undermine the foundation of the two-state solution and intensify efforts to advance the political process towards its realization. President, China will continue to work with the international community to end the fighting in Gaza, alleviate humanitarian suffering, implement the two-state solution, and ultimately achieve a comprehensive, just, and lasting solution to the Palestinian question so that people on both sides can enjoy peace and happiness. Thank you, President.
Agradezco a
I thank the representative of China for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of France. Mr. President, I thank the Assistant Secretary General, Mr. Yencha, for his briefing, as well as Mr. Eli David for his moving testimony. I wish, on behalf of France, to assure him of our solidarity and our support. I wish to welcome here the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the State of Israel, Mr. Gideon Sa'ar. I also wish to welcome the presence of the Observer of Palestine. Abject cruelty. Boundless inhumanity. That is what Hamas embodies. The unbearable images that we've seen in recent days showing Israeli hostages held in Gaza, together with your testimony, Mr. David, remind us of horrifying images. France denounces these vile methods and condemns the cruel treatment inflicted on hostages by Hamas and by Islamic Jihad. We think with emotion of your brother, Evatai David, of Rom Braslavsky, and of all of the hostages still being held, as well as their families and loved ones who have been plunged into this nightmare for over 660 days now. Their ordeal must come to an end. We also think of all of the hostages who've perished in appalling conditions, including French nationals. France remains in solidarity with the families of all hostages and with the Israeli people in the face of the barbaric acts committed by Hamas since the 7th of October 2023. Mr. President, the immediate release of all hostages is an absolute priority for France. We continue to work tirelessly to secure their unconditional release and the return of the remains of the hostages who died in Gaza. we will continue to act to restore the ceasefire without delay and to enable the large-scale delivery of humanitarian aid, which remains blocked at Gaza's gates. France reiterates the urgent need for Israel to open all crossing points and to allow immediate, large-scale and unimpeded access for humanitarian assistance. Alarmed by the scale of the humanitarian catastrophe, France, alongside several other countries, has carried out an airdrop of non-perishable food supplies over Gaza. This is an emergency measure to save lives, but it cannot replace the need for massive land-based humanitarian access. These efforts must be accompanied by a political resolution based on the two-state solution, the only realistic path to lasting peace. This solution requires the recognition of a sovereign Palestinian state with renewed governance. It also requires the total demilitarization of Hamas and its complete exclusion from any form of governance in the Gaza Strip. Finally, it requires Israel's regional integration. France welcomes the historic gesture made last week in New York by Arab countries during the International Conference on the Implementation of the Two-State Solution, co-chaired with Saudi Arabia, when for the first time they condemned Hamas's crimes and expressed their aspiration to establish relations with the State of Israel. This is how we will break the cycle of violence and reopen the path to peace in the Middle East. It is the only possible path to a future where justice, security, and dignity can be guaranteed for all peoples of the region. Thank you. I thank the representative of France for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the ASG Yencha for his briefing, and I also appreciate Mr. David for sharing his voice with the Council. Also extend my heartfelt sympathy with you and your family. I also welcome the participation of His Excellency, Sir, Minister of the Foreign Affairs, and then permanent representative of the Observer State of the Palestine to this meeting. Mr. President, the world is horrified to see the tragedy unfolding in Gaza at this very moment. We are appalled by the fact that Hamas, who committed one of the worst terrorist attacks in recent history, still holds 50 hostages for almost 2 years in utterly inhumane conditions. We also witness every day appalling videos and images in the media of the scores of the bone-emaciated Palestinian civilians who have not been spared from the escalating famine stalking life in Gaza. Reiterating our deepest concern of the deteriorating conditions for the hostages as well as civilians in Gaza and the West Bank, let me stress following 3 points. First, the swift and unhindered delivery of all humanitarian aid should be ensured at scale in full collaboration with the United Nations. Starvation must not be weaponized. We take note of the reports claiming Israel has begun tactical pauses for 10 hours a day in al-Mawasi, Deir al-Balah, and Gaza City. This announcement is better than nothing, but has not improved the hunger situation on the ground. Republic of Korea calls on Israel to open all available crossings, ensure safe and speedy delivery of and the access to humanitarian aid. We call on Israel to uphold its commitments and then to expand the humanitarian pauses throughout the Gaza Strip. We also call on Israel to ensure the activities of the UN humanitarian agencies and their partners. Coordination must be limited to essential measures to guarantee their safe work, and there must not be any administrative hindrances. Second, the war in Gaza must end now. Thus, we reiterate our strong support for the efforts by the mediators, including the U.S. We understand that a deal to secure ceasefire and the release of the hostages is the only viable option for Israel to end the war. While reiterating our condemnation of a heinous act of Hamas, the brutality of Hamas does not legitimize the extended and disproportionate suffering of the Palestinian civilians in Gaza. Israel must also faithfully engage in the negotiations, carefully listening to the voices of the desperate families of the 50 hostages still held in Gaza, who are appealing for immediate end to the war. We hope that the mediators will continue their efforts to reach a deal that will lead to a permanent end to the war and release of all hostages. Third, all parties must prioritize peaceful coexistence and mutual recognition in line with the Resolution 2334. This resolution was a cornerstone agreement by the Council based on the urgent need to shift negative trends on the ground. All elements in the resolution must be fully respected. Republic of Korea fully supports the two-state solution as the only viable path forward. As such, we urge Israel to join the international call to enhance peace, prosperity, and dignity for all in Israel and Palestine. I thank you, Mr. President.
Agradezco.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Mr. President, I thank you for convening this meeting. I also thank ASG Jenka for his briefing, and we listened attentively to Mr. Eli David as he shared his personal account concerning the fate of his brother who remains in captivity in Gaza. His brother should never have stayed in captivity if the ceasefire in Gaza was not abruptly breached by the Israeli occupying power. Let us be clear. Algeria does not stand idle before the suffering of humankind. Wherever pain works, our conscience works with it. For us, the call of humanity is not a choice. It is a sacred duty. Every human being, regardless of gender, color, creed, or border, civilians and soldiers alike, as Mr. Eviatar David, deserve to be treated humanly and to live with dignity. We do not weigh lives on scales of interest. There are no double standards in our moral compass. What we ask for the Palestinian people, we ask for all people. And Algeria holds the right to food as sacred. It's not a privilege, it is a right enshrined in Article 25 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The right of everyone to an adequate standard of living, a right to food, a right to dignity, a right to life. We have long warned of the catastrophe in Gaza. We have echoed repeatedly the plights of a Palestinian starving people. we have joined the calls made by nearly every voice on earth, except a few. And today, this meeting is called by the Israeli occupying power, who blatantly denied the famine in Gaza. The same occupying power that cut off food, water, electricity, and medicine in Gaza. The same power that on July 29th was condemned by United Nations experts. They said it plainly, and I quote, Israel's acts in Gaza are barbaric. Government officials may be committing crime under the Rome statutes, extermination by starvation, end of quote. These are not our words. These are the findings of international experts. Mr. President, what has been allowed very recently into Gaza as humanitarian relief is a drop in an ocean of need. Airdrops are not the solution. You cannot feed people from the sky while allowing the sealing of the land under them. The Israeli occupying power must open all crossing, all roads, all lifelines. This is not a request. Let me be clear. Humanitarian access is a legal obligation under the Geneva Conventions. It's not a favor. It is not negotiable. It cannot be used as a bargaining chips in exchange for those held in captivity. The IPC has spoken. The worst-case scenario is unfolding in Gaza. Famine thresholds have been crossed. Malnutrition is rampant among all people in Gaza, including, unfortunately, including those in captivity. The reality long denied by the Israeli occupying power has never been a secret to anyone. It was known. It was felt. It was lived daily by the people of Gaza. Today, the image that shocked some should surprise no one. Food insecurity grips every household. Hunger is not an exception. It is the rule. The truth, long suppressed, is now visible in all who choose to see, not to shrug off. According to some sources, as of yesterday, credible sources, 180 people have died from starvation. Among them, 93 children. This is real. This is undeniable. They were lives, not statistics. They had dreams. They had names. Names? Zainab Abu Halib, a baby who died from malnutrition. Misk al-Medhoum, a child suffering from malnutrition. Razan Abu Zahar, who died of hunger. Mr. President, more than 61,000 Palestinians have already been killed. Since the month of March, more than 1,500 were killed while seeking food, and over 100,000, 150,000 were injured. What we are witnessing is not erratic. It is methodical. Call it what it is: genocide, 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 as described by Israeli voices, by David Grossman, by Guy Chalet, and others, as seen by humanitarians on the ground, as felt by the whole world. And still some denied it. No ignorance can excuse it. No silence can justify it. Future generations will ask, where were you? Where were you when Gaza was starving? In the Security Council? Where were you when children died searching for food, for bread? In the Security Council? Where were you when an entire people was crushed in the name of security? And history will record those who so often lectured us on the right to self-defense. Those who denied the crime were complicit. Those who stayed silent were witnesses of shame. Mr. President, injustice must never be normalized. It cannot become the new ordinary. That's why we call firmly and repeatedly for a ceasefire, to save lives, to save hopes, to save dreams not yet dreamed. It's why we call for an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. I'd like to start by thanking ASG Yenka for your briefing. I also want to express my gratitude to Eli David for his powerful advocacy in support of his brother and for the hostages in Gaza. I want to reassure Mr. David through the Israeli delegation that the UK stands with your family and the families of all those who have suffered due to Hamas' inhuman and cruel actions, including British citizen Ditsa Orr, whose son Avinatan remains in captivity. This Council has called for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages in all 4 of its resolutions since October 7th, and I repeat that call today. As my Foreign Secretary has said, the images of Eviatar and other emaciated hostages paraded in front of cameras for propaganda are depraved. Hamas and its terrorist ideology can have no place in the future governance of Gaza and should never again threaten Israel's security. President, the ceasefire at the beginning of this year was a rare moment of hope, which allowed hostages to be released and the UN to surge aid into Gaza. Since the ceasefire ended, the suffering of the hostages and Palestinian civilians has plumbed new and shocking depths. Israel's aid restrictions have led to famine now unfolding in Gaza, as reported by the IPC. Last week, I spoke with doctors who had served in Gaza. They had seen children so malnourished that their wounds festered for months without healing. They had seen baby formula confiscated by the IDF at the border, depriving newborns of the basic essentials for life. I call on Israel now to act to alleviate this horrendous suffering. We need to see restrictions on aid delivery lifted in line with the principles of humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence. And the UN must be able to operate safely and at scale. We also call for all land routes to be opened for essential supplies, including food, baby formula, medicine, fuel, and clean water. We call for Israel to ensure the protection of civilians, medics, and aid workers. And we are appalled that another Palestinian Red Crescent worker was killed this week by an Israeli strike on its headquarters. Israel must investigate this and other similar incidents. President, as I said, the ceasefire earlier this year showed what can be achieved when there is political will. And last week's two-state solution conference showed what can be achieved when the international community comes together. We urge the parties to reinvigorate their efforts to secure a ceasefire deal and an end to the conflict. As my Prime Minister set out last week, the UK is ready to play its full and historic part in achieving a plan which ends the bloodshed, brings the hostages home, and lays the foundation for a Palestinian state. Statehood is the inalienable right of the Palestinian people and is essential to the long-term security of Israel. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Assistant Secretary General Mr. Bianca for his important briefing. And I also commend Mr. Leah David for his courage in sharing his testimony today and for his relentless advocacy on behalf of the hostages. since the abduction of his brother. To Mr. David, the families of all hostages, and all victims of this conflict in Gaza, we extend our deepest sympathies and solidarity. We welcome the participation of His Excellency, Mr. Gideon Sa'ar, Minister for Foreign Affairs of the State of Israel, the participation of the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine, as well as the representative of Argentina. We also acknowledge a letter from the permanent representative of Israel dated 2nd August 2025, drawing the attention of the Council to the plight of Israeli hostages in Gaza. This Council bears a solemn duty to address all dimensions of this conflict in line with the Charter of the United Nations and international law. The conflict in the Gaza Strip continues to inflict immense suffering on civilians in both Israel and Gaza. Since the 7th October 2023 attack, hostages and civilians alike have endured grave humanitarian consequences. The abduction by Hamas and other armed groups of 250 hostages, men, women, and children as young as 9 months, as well as old as 85, constitute a flagrant violation of international law, including international humanitarian law. SEDON condemns these and all acts of violence against civilians, regardless of identity or location. Article 34 of the 4th Geneva Convention explicitly prohibits hostage-taking, a prohibition that has crystallized as part of customary international law. Hostage-taking is also codified as a war crime under Article 8 of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. We remain gravely concerned that 50 individuals remain in captivity with no information on their condition and no access to humanitarian assistance. Recent media videos have shown their appalling treatment. We strongly condemn all inhumane treatment of hostages and reiterate our unequivocal demand for their immediate and unconditional release, as mandated by Security Council resolutions 2712, 2720, 2728, and 2735. Resolution 2735 also endorsed terms for the release of Palestinian detainees. We call for the release of thousands of Palestinians detained in Israel without trial or adequate care, in violations of international law and their inherent right and dignity. The International Committee of the Red Cross must be granted immediate access to all detainees to provide medical and humanitarian assistance. Allegations of mistreatment must be investigated and accountability ensured for all grave violations committed in this conflict, including those arising from the ongoing occupation of Palestinian territories. Mr. President, one atrocity cannot justify another. While we express deep concern for the hostages, we cannot ignore the wider humanitarian catastrophe that has engulfed Gaza. International law prohibits the collective punishment of civilians. Article 33 of the 4th Geneva Convention forbids punishment of a population for acts they did not commit. Yet, the people of Gaza have been subjected to a blockade and siege that deprive them of food, water, fuel, and medical supplies. The deliberate use of starvation as a method of warfare is absolutely prohibited under Article 54 of the Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions and is classified as a war crime by the Rome Statute. The images of emaciated bodies and widespread malnutrition underscore the devastating consequence of this deprivation. The International Court of Justice, in its provisional measures orders of 26 January and 28 March 2024, determined that the Palestinian population in Gaza faces a real and imminent risk of irreparable harm. Acting under the Genocide Convention, the court ordered the State of Israel to take all measures within its power to prevent acts of genocide, including ensuring the provision of humanitarian assistance. These binding provisional measures must be fully implemented, and this Council shares responsibility to ensure compliance. The man-made humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, resulting from policies of the government of Israel, is unprecedented in scale and severity. The suffering of Israeli hostages is acute and must be addressed urgently. Likewise, this is occurring alongside the suffering of an entire civilian population subjected to famine and relentless bombardment. We urge the State of Israel to lift the blockade and facilitate unimpeded humanitarian access. Likewise, we urge Hamas and other armed groups to cease attacks on civilians and release all hostages. Accountability for violations of international law is a shared obligation. States must ensure that their actions do not facilitate breaches of law. United Nations Special Rapporteurs have warned about the responsibility of states on weapon supplies in the context of the conflict. Mr. President, in recalling the words of former President Dwight D. Eisenhower in his 1953 Chants for Peace address, he said the true burden of states with powers lies not in militarization, but in building peace and prosperity. This truth remains urgent today as we confront this devastating conflict. So it underscores that resolving the conflict and the Palestinian question requires a political pathway. The Arab Peace Initiative, recently reinforced through the draft New York Declaration, as co-chaired by France and Saudi Arabia, offers an important framework. It proposes the disarmament of Hamas, the reunification of Gaza and the West Bank under the Palestinian Authority, and transitional arrangement with international support. The plan also calls for an immediate ceasefire, humanitarian access, and renewed negotiations towards realizing the two-state solution. These proposals deserve serious consideration by all parties and support from this Council. The intended recognition of the State of Palestine by several states, albeit conditional, is a step in the right direction. This conflict cannot be resolved through military means. Its root cause lies in the prolonged occupation of Palestinian territory. The International Court of Justice, in its advisory opinions, including the 2024 Advisory Opinion on Israeli Practices and the Security Council Resolutions 242 and 2334, have consistently affirmed the illegality of settlement activity and the inadmissibility of acquiring territory by force. Yet these legal obligations remain unimplemented, perpetuating cycles of violence and impunity. For the sake of the victims on both sides, the time has come to translate declarations and resolutions into concrete action. This Council must work collectively to end the occupation and enable the establishment of a sovereign, viable, and contiguous state of Palestine alongside the state of Israel, with secure and recognized borders. This remains the only path to a just and lasting peace. Sierra Leone welcomes all diplomatic efforts that advance this goal. In closing, Mr. President, we must reiterate that the suffering of one side cannot justify the suffering of the other. As Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states, and I quote, "All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and right. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood," and you can add sisterhood. Both Israelis and Palestinians deserve to live in dignity, security, and freedom. The veil of impunity must be lifted. It is now time for decisive action to end this conflict and bring about a just and lasting peace. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
Mr. President, we join colleagues in thanking Assistant Secretary General Miroslav Zhencha for his briefing. We also listened with deep empathy to Mr. David's statement and sincerely hope for the safe and swift reunification of his family and all others still held in captivity. The taking of hostages is a clear violation of international law and totally unacceptable. Hostages must be released. Among other things, this was a clear demand in the draft resolution of the Security Council presented by the E10, including Pakistan in June. At the same time, let us be clear on the gravity of the overall situation on the ground. And it is not just we here in the Security Council or the wider membership in the General Assembly who are watching and who are worried. The entire world is watching in disbelief. Civilians have suffered the brunt of Israel's war on Gaza. Nothing can justify the indiscriminate killings, the starvation of an entire population, the collective punishment of a besieged people. These actions are not only morally indefensible, they constitute grave breaches of international law, including the Geneva Conventions, and stand in flagrant violation of binding measures issued by the International Court of Justice. Mr. President, the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza continues to escalate at an unprecedented scale. According to UN human rights experts, Israel's widespread and systemic abuse of Palestinians in detention and arbitrary arrest practices over decades, coupled with the absence of any restraints by the Israeli state since 7th October 2023, paint a shocking picture enabled by absolute impunity. Around 9,500 Palestinians, including hundreds of children and women, are currently imprisoned, around one-third without charge or trial. This is a profound violation of basic human rights and, again, totally unacceptable. 60,000 Gazans have been killed, 18,500 children. Palestinian children have been killed at a rate more than 1 per hour since the war began. Mr. President, although I could have said this, but this is not my statement. It is the Washington Post, which has also published the names and ages of each of those 18,500 Palestinian children. The leading Israeli newspaper, Haaretz, has described the situation in Gaza as, quote, likely the most extreme example of politically driven starvation in the 21st century, unquote. The consequences are therefore horrible. At least 175 Palestinians, including 93 children, have died of starvation. The Director General of the FAO has warned Gaza is now on the brink of a full-scale famine. People are not starving because food is unavailable. They are starving because access is denied. The Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, IPC, has warned that the worst-case scenario of famine is now unfolding in the Gaza Strip. UNICEF has called it a perfect storm of suffering for children, while the UN Secretary General has warned of a humanitarian catastrophe of epic proportions. The World Food Programme put it starkly, quote, this is a disaster unfolding in front of our eyes, in front of our television screens. Mr. President, even the delivery of humanitarian aid has become deadly. Over 1,200 aid-related killings have been documented since May. Palestinians are routinely forced to choose between two deadly options: risking death by starvation or risking death by gunfire to reach food aid site. And this is what the New York Times is saying, Mr. President. This war on civilians must end. We call for an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire, full Israeli withdrawal, the release of hostages, and unimpeded humanitarian access. The initial phase of the ceasefire agreement, brokered by Egypt, Qatar, and the United States, led to the release of 33 hostages. But for Israel's unilateral abandonment of the ceasefire, further releases could not take place. Thus, the suffering continues, and it continues on both sides. We further call for the full implementation of Security Council Resolution 2735, which presents a viable, actionable roadmap to end hostilities and deliver desperately needed aid. Mr. President, in the interest of peace, for that is the core responsibility of this Council, we must keep in mind the historical perspective of the Arab-Israeli conflict. We must not lose sight of the root cause of this ongoing tragedy, and that is Israel's prolonged illegal occupation of the Palestinian territory. As long as this occupation endures, peace will remain elusive. Lasting peace demands a credible political horizon, one grounded in international law, leading to the realization of a sovereign, viable, and contiguous Palestinian state based on the pre-1967 borders, with Al-Quds al-Sharif as its capital. The recent high-level conference on the peaceful settlement of the Palestinian question and the implementation of the two-state solution was a timely initiative. It must be followed up by concrete and coordinated international action to finally achieve the long-coveted peace and stability in the Middle East. Mr. President, human rights are universal and indivisible. Human rights cannot be partitioned, and justice must never be selective. The imperative, legal, political, and moral, is crystal clear. We must act now to end Israel's brutal and illegal war and the unconscionable suffering of the people. Humanity and dignity of peoples, civilians on both sides, demand nothing less. I thank you.
Agradezco.
I thank the representative of Pakistan for the statement. And I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Mr. President. We are grateful to the Assistant Secretary General Miroslav Yencha for his detailed briefing on the situation in Gaza and the situation with the hostages who remain in the enclave. We note the presence amongst us of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Israel, Gideon Sar. We listened very carefully to Ella David, and we studied very carefully to the letter by the Israeli side, and we mourn for all the innocent victims of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, regardless of their citizenship and nationality. As all of those present here, we also were shocked by the footage earlier this month showing two Israeli hostages, Ron Braslavsky and Aviator David. In the video, they looked depressed, severely emaciated, and weakened because of an acute shortage of food and water, which, as we know, is something that all people in Gaza encounter. Every day spent by the hostages in Gaza is a tragedy for themselves, for their families, who spend every minute of their time waiting for their return. We also listened very carefully to the recent statements made by the relatives of Ron Braslavsky, Aviator David, and other Israelis held in Gaza. And we share their pain, but we cannot overlook the fact that the people who are in such a terrible emotional state and who fear for their children also voice a direct criticism of the leadership of the country, which, according to some of them, is drawing out the negotiating process with Hamas and thereby is assigning a death warrant for the remaining hostages. Let me recall here that we immediately condemn the tragic events of the 7th of October 2023. There can be no justification for that, nor can there be a justification for the collective punishment of the people in Gaza and turning a whole region into a zone of total despair. We advocated and continue advocating an immediate and unconditional release of all detainees and an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. Mr. President, we are sincerely convinced that there is no delegation in this room which would dispute the very simple fact that the life of any person is important and priceless, and we shouldn't have to decide whose suffering is more worthy of attention. This applies equally to the Israelis in captivity and to the peaceful Palestinians who, for now 670 days, have been essentially suffering the bombardment by Israel. At the time when the whole world will watch the terrible footage of Rom Braslavsky and Viator David with horror, from Gaza, we received shocking data about the fact that since the 1st to the 2nd of August, 180 people died there. Such tragedies is something that we receive information about essentially daily. Since October 2023, more than 61,000 Palestinians have died, and amongst them, according to UNICEF, 18,000 are children. Against this background, the general situation in Gaza can only be characterized as a humanitarian catastrophe. And this has consequences not just for the Gazans, but also for the Israeli hostages. Palestinians themselves are dying in the enclave not only as a result of air bombs or artillery shelling, but also because of widespread hunger and disease outbreaks. According to the World Food Programme, every third Palestinian is going hungry for several days in a row. The grim statistics of the victims of hostilities and the lack of hunger is compounded by the dead and wounded as they line up for food rations at the sites of the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. And there the numbers of victims is in the thousands. Since 27th of May, almost 1,500 Palestinians were killed. We're seriously worried also by the consequences of the practice that was resumed since the end of July, the practice of airdropping of food supplies. As recently as yesterday, the humanitarian bombs crushed to death two medical workers from the Al-Aqsa hospital in Deir el-Balah. The Commissioner General of UNRWA, Mr. Lazzarini, in his recent comments warned against using such dangerous and costly way of supplying assistance. It's 100 times more expensive than using the land routes. Meanwhile, on the perimeter of this strip, there are 6,000 trucks with sufficient food supplies which would provide enough food to provide for several months for civilians. Mr. President, we are shocked by the targeted attack by IDF on the headquarters of the Palestinian Red Crescent Society in Han Yunis, as a result of which one staff died and several people were injured. Unfortunately, this is not the first time when members of the Red Crescent Society in Gaza died. We recall how the Israeli military mercilessly shot the ambulance Red Crescent, and their bodies were found in a mass grave subsequently. We call on Israel to stop this lawlessness. Humanitarians and medical workers should not be targeted, nor should the headquarters of the Red Crescent be targeted. It's clearly marked with its logo and unambiguously is under the protection of international humanitarian law. Contrary to the statement by West Jerusalem, the humanitarian blockade that they initiated in March essentially remains to date. What was announced on the 27th of July, namely partial easements and limited deliveries within the framework of the so-called tactical pauses, according to the UN humanitarians, is just a drop in the ocean compared to the acute needs of the Gazans, including, as we all understand, the needs of the Israeli hostages. In this context, we fully support the calls by the leadership of UNRWA and other specialized UN agencies to immediately remove the impediments to supplying into Gaza all of the essential things, including food, water, fuel, and medicines. We're very concerned by the aggressive campaign deployed by West Jerusalem against the staff of UN OCHA and its head, Tom Fletcher, who provide a sober and uncomfortable uncomfortable for Israel sometimes assessments of humanitarian situation. We can see that humanitarians are trying to analyze it comprehensively and find some ways of easing the plight of Palestinian civilians. What is undeniable here is that in order to have an uninterrupted and unimpeded humanitarian supplies, the main thing that is needed is to create the necessary security conditions. Unfortunately, the regular calls for a ceasefire that we hear from the Secretary General and from the absolute majority of the international community remain without due reaction from Israeli leadership. West Jerusalem continues intending to continue with the war in Gaza using by any means and under any pretext, and tries to prevent the stoppage of a military operation in the sector. Mr. President, we are equally concerned also by the fact that the Israeli authorities decided to cleanse and colonize the West Bank of the Jordan River. The victims of continuous raids by security services and violence of settlements, the victims of that are the regular Palestinians and foreigners sometimes. For example, on the 30th of July, there was an attack against the office vehicle of the Russian representation with the Palestinian Authority. And this was done under the lenient eye of the Israeli military. Furthermore, there are new negative records being made of the destruction and seizure of the property of the local citizens, building new settlements, legalizing outposts to make sure that the Palestinian towns are not connected to each other. Knesset continues passing new provocative passages. Following yesterday's decision to ban UNRWA at the end of July, there was another dangerous decision made about extending Israeli sovereignty of the West Bank. It is clear the systematic expulsion of the Palestinians, be it from Gaza or the West Bank, is something that's fraught with new risks and dangers for the stability and security of the Middle East, and can yet once again bring the region to the brink of a major war. It is also clear that the complete freedom of action that the Israelis have, freedom to do anything in Gaza or in the West Bank, would have been impossible without a direct military support and international and political cover provided by the United States. At the same time, the absolute majority of states in the world are rejecting this line. And what is telling in this situation was the Israeli and American boycott of the conference on the 28th, 30th of July, the high-level conference in support of this two-state solution, and the futile attempts by Washington to dissuade their partners from participating in this representative forum. We do have certain optimism from the fact that despite the pressure from the Americans, the majority of the international community remained unintimidated and showed solidarity with the Palestinian people. And some Western capitals, although belatedly, nonetheless announced their plans to recognize the state of Palestine next month. Mr. President, despite this fact that the situation is very difficult, we remain convinced that the diplomatic settlement of the conflict was and remains the only viable solution here. And we call on the parties with support of mediations to return to the negotiating table so as to work out mutually acceptable solutions so as to restore the ceasefire regime, release those who are detained, and unblock the humanitarian access to the Gaza Strip. And we are confident that this is what the people of Palestine want, as well as the families of hostages, including the relatives of Israelis held in Gaza. And we hope that all regional and international stakeholders will work towards this goal. The negotiation process must return to a political track, which will the kind that will accommodate both Israelis' legitimate security interests and the Palestinian people's hard-earned right to establish their own state within the 1967 borders. I thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Somalia.
Mr. President, I thank you for convening this important meeting, and I also appreciate ASG Yanka for his valuable briefing. And I also take note of the testimonies shared today by Mr. David and sympathize with the suffering and endured by all families in this conflict. And we heed our call to act now and to bring an end to this devastating conflict. A conflict where just over the past weekend, bombardments have intensified across the Strip, including areas where displaced families sought safety and refuge. A conflict which had made clear that there's no safe place in Gaza. A conflict where continued military operations in a densely populated areas have led to immense civilian suffering and destructions. The longer this conflict continues, the greater the humanitarian tragedy and the further away from the prospect of peace. Starvation is now a present and expanding reality for many. Somalia stresses that the use of starvation as a method of warfare is unacceptable and prohibited under international law. Access to water, food, electricity, and healthcare remains extremely limited. The humanitarian response is constrained by insecurity and restricted access. My delegation reiterates its call for an immediate and lasting ceasefire. We also call for the full, safe, and unhindered delivery of humanitarian aid, including opening all crossings and lifting the siege on Gaza. We recognize and commend the vital role the UN humanitarian agencies play in providing life-saving assistance under exceptionally challenging conditions. Their efforts are indispensable to alleviating suffering and must be supported and protected. We also express concern about the recent Israeli actions at Jerusalem Holy Site, which challenges the established status quo and risk increasing tensions at this sensitive site, potentially undermining efforts toward peace and stability. We call for respect of existing agreements and exercise restraint to preserve calm and foster conditions for meaningful dialogue. Mr. President, Somalia emphasizes the imperative to protect all civilians and uphold international humanitarian and human rights law. We reiterate our call for the immediate release of all civilian hostages and detainees, respect for civilian life, and adherence to international legal standards must guide all actions without exception. We are also concerned by escalating violence in the West Bank, including settler attacks and home demolitions. Lasting peace cannot be achieved while such violations persist. There is no military solution to this conflict. The root cause of the crisis lies in decades of occupation and the denial of the Palestinian people's right to self-determination. In this context, my delegation reaffirms its unwavering support for the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people, including their right to self-determination and to establish an independent sovereign state of Palestine with Al-Quds al-Sharif as its capital, in accordance with relevant UN resolutions and the Arab Peace Initiative. My delegation supports the efforts facilitated by Qatar, the United States, and Egypt aimed at ending the violence, protecting the civilians, and opening a genuine political horizon. My delegation reaffirms its commitment to the two-state solution as recently pledged at the high-level conference co-organized by Saudi Arabia and France. We also underscore the importance of the unification of Gaza and the West Bank under a single legitimate Palestinian Authority, as well as the urgent need for a comprehensive plan for Gaza's reconstruction. My delegation remains firmly committed to the principles of international law, the UN Charter, and to the cause of peace, justice, and dignity for all people in the Middle East. The people of Gaza and all those affected by this conflict deserve nothing less than for us to act now and to give peace a chance, and for our collective resolve and compassion. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Somalia for the statement. And I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, Assistant Secretary General Miroslav Yencha, for your briefing. And I welcome the Israeli Minister of Foreign Affairs at this meeting. And I thank you, Eli David, for your courage in sharing your story. The pain and grief that you and other families of hostages have faced at the hands of Hamas is unfathomable. And the United States stands with you and will continue to work to free all of the remaining hostages, living and deceased. Colleagues, the horrific videos of hostages, Evyatar David and Rom Braslevsky, filmed by the terrorist groups Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, should shock and appall the world. The footage of these two young men, tormented, starved, emaciated, is not only a reminder of the evil that Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad represent. It also makes more clear than ever that the Security Council and the international community must stop pressuring Israel and instead impose maximum pressure on Hamas to immediately release all 50 hostages that they continue to hold captive. The hostages abducted on October 7th have now suffered for 668 days. These videos show Evyatar David, a 24-year-old kidnapped by Hamas from the Nova Music Festival, with an appearance his own family described as a living skeleton buried alive, being forced by his terrorist captors to dig his own grave. Rom Braslevsky, a 21-year-old abducted from the Nova Festival, is pictured in similarly dire conditions. The United States has made clear that freeing the hostages is our priority, along with ensuring Hamas disarms and no longer rules Gaza. President Trump, Special Envoy Witkoff, and Secretary Rubio continue to work tirelessly to end the war, release the hostages, including Itai Chen and Omer Nutra, the two Americans still held by Hamas, and bring peace to Gaza and give it a future free of Hamas. As President Trump said last week, the fastest way to end the humanitarian crisis in Gaza is for Hamas to surrender and release the hostages. Yet Hamas has refused to do so. While Israel has accepted the terms of the ceasefire proposal, Hamas has consistently rejected them. That is emblematic of the bad faith we see from Hamas. Unfortunately, at a time when pressure on Hamas is more necessary than ever to free the hostages and end the war, some have instead taken steps that embolden Hamas and undermine the negotiators' efforts. We must be clear that unproductive publicity stunts like last week's two-state solution conference and unilateral announcements regarding recognition of a Palestinian state undercut the efforts of mediators and prolong the war. These gifts to Hamas not only imperil the hostages, they also hurt the civilians of Gaza, who continue to suffer what President Trump has recognized as real starvation. Colleagues, no one wants to see Palestinians, civilians in Gaza go hungry and thirsty. The United States supports getting assistance to civilians in Gaza and has been actively working to support the secure delivery of humanitarian aid to civilians in Gaza. As President Trump has said, the United States is going to be even more involved in these efforts. On Friday, Special Envoy Witkoff and Ambassador Huckabee traveled to Gaza, where they met with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation and other agencies and visited GHF aid distribution sites. The GHF recently announced reaching the milestone of delivering more than 100 million meals directly to civilians in Gaza. On Sunday alone, the GHF reported delivering more than 1.5 million meals at its distribution sites. We recognize the important actions Israel has taken to facilitate the increased flow of aid into Gaza. Those who have professed concern about the reported risk of famine should join the United States in supporting the GHF's work in securely delivering food to civilians in Gaza. It is essential that our humanitarian response help those civilians without benefiting Hamas. Mr. President, countries, including the members of this council, face a choice: whether to continue with actions that reward and encourage Hamas, or whether to hold the terrorist organization responsible for its actions. We should all be able to agree that the hostages must be freed without further delay, and that Hamas can no longer rule Gaza and must disarm. The hostages must be returned home, and Palestinians in Gaza must be allowed to begin a new chapter free of Hamas. President, we have once again heard members here make allegations of genocide. These allegations are politically motivated and categorically false. They are part of a deliberate, cynical propaganda campaign as Hamas attempts to win symbolic victories to compensate for total defeat in war. The United States refutes these allegations entirely. The United States fully supports Israel's right to defend itself against Hamas's terrorism. Israel has taken numerous measures to limit harm to civilians and to address humanitarian needs. The loss of civilian life in Gaza is tragic, but the responsibility for this rests with Hamas, which could stop the fighting today by agreeing to the ceasefire already accepted by Israel. And with respect to recent reports of deaths of Palestinians near GHF aid distribution sites, I would say that the GHF has stated that recent reports of deaths near their distribution sites are false. The most recent tragedy occurred near UN convoys after they passed through the Zikim crossing. The UN continues to turn down the GHF's offers to collaborate and coordinate efforts. We mourn the loss of all innocent lives and agree that more assistance needs to safely reach those in need. And we encourage all to support the GHF's efforts. President, in closing, the United States calls upon all countries to join together and say with one clear voice that Hamas must immediately surrender, release all the hostages, both those living and those who have already been murdered at the hands of Hamas, and allow this war to end. I thank you.
Agradezco.
I thank the representative of the United States for the statement. And I now give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And also we thank Assistant Secretary General Jenča for his briefing, and we acknowledge the presence of Foreign Minister Saar and the permanent representative of the State of Palestine in the meeting. We thank Eli David for sharing his deeply personal testimony. The images of your brother, Avatar, which were published days ago, are simply horrifying. And we feel and we share the pain, unbearable pain of your family. We strongly condemn Hamas and Islamic Jihad for their cruelty towards the hostages. All images coming from Gaza these days of hostages and of malnourished children shock us to our core. They remind us of the unacceptable suffering of civilians 1 year and 9 months into this war. And our public keeps asking what else needs to happen in Gaza for the world to move and stop this war. Slovenia reiterates today its call for the immediate, unconditional, and dignified release of all hostages. This has been our call from the beginning. International law is clear. Hostages taking is prohibited. Using their starved images as propaganda is simply barbaric. We once again condemn the heinous acts of Hamas and other terrorist groups of October 7. While in captivity, all hostages must be afforded humane treatment. They must receive the medical care and attention they so desperately require, and the ICRC should be granted immediate access to them. Colleagues, recognizing the suffering of the hostages does not diminish the suffering of Palestinian civilians in Gaza, and vice versa. Recognizing the suffering of Palestinians does not diminish the suffering of the hostages. The suffering of all civilians caught in this war is intolerable. The humanity of the 21st century and this Council should not allow this type of inhumane treatment to continue. Mr. President, deliberate starvation is unlawful and morally unacceptable, wherever it happens and whoever perpetrates. All parties have obligations under international humanitarian law, and yet in Gaza, these obligations have been systematically and gravely violated with devastating consequences. We must be honest about the reality of the situation on the ground, and my Pakistani colleague has already quoted the IPC panel, which just last week raised an alarm that the worst-case scenario of famine and humanitarian catastrophe is unfolding before our eyes. Israel is obliged to facilitate humanitarian aid. Instead, the months-long Israeli blockade has led us to a point of moral outrage. We see with our own eyes how the vulnerable are suffering: children, older persons, persons with disabilities, pregnant and breastfeeding women, and hostages. No one is immune. Small improvements and public proclamations of humanitarian pauses are way past due and simply not enough. We demand immediate, safe, and unhindered delivery of humanitarian assistance at scale to the population of Gaza. The UN and humanitarians must be able to do their life-saving work safely and securely. They have proven that they can deliver if only they are allowed to do their job. We also appeal once again for the establishment of a corridor to facilitate medical evacuations of patients from Gaza to hospitals in East Jerusalem and the West Bank. Mr. President, each human being has inherent dignity and value. In the midst of tragedy and chaos, we must never allow ourselves to deny the human element of this crisis. Names like Evatar David and Rom Braslavsky should not go unspoken or be forgotten in this chamber. Neither should names of children like Hind Rajab, killed while pleading for help, and Mahmoud Aijur, who lost both arms. And many names we may never know. Countless lives destroyed, countless lives lost. As the father of one hostage powerfully said, in a competition of pain, there are no winners. We recall how during the ceasefire early this year, we witnessed scenes of hostages being reunited with their families, of aid at scale moving through crossings, of Palestinian children returning to school, of families returning to their homes, even if only rubble was left behind. We hold on the hope that this can once again become a reality. We need an immediate ceasefire and an end to the suffering of hostages and civilians alike. Slovenia urges all parties to recommit to ceasefire talks. Slovenia firmly rejects any plans to expand military operations in Gaza, which would seriously endanger civilians, including hostages, and compound the humanitarian catastrophe. There is no military solution to this suffering. Experience has shown that it brings us no closer to peace, freedom, or security for Palestinians or for Israelis. A lasting ceasefire must be secured. A ceasefire gives desperate relief to all in Gaza, living under relentless bombardment. A ceasefire brings hostages home. A ceasefire puts food on tables. And a ceasefire provides space for a political horizon towards a two-state solution. We must renew our demand for a ceasefire now. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for the statement. And I now give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank Assistant Secretary General Miroslav Jenca for his briefing, as well as Mr. Eli David for his powerful and moving testimony. And I express my deep sympathy for the suffering you, Mr. David, and other relatives of hostages have endured. I would also like to welcome the presence of His Excellency Mr. Gideon Sar, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Israel, to this meeting, as well as of the representatives of the Observer State of Palestine and Argentina. Mr. President, Greece reiterates its firm condemnation of the heinous terrorist attacks perpetrated by Hamas on October 7. The recently released images of hostages were yet another stark reminder of this continuing calamity. Today, we stand in solidarity with the victims and the families, and above all, with those who remain in captivity. Our thoughts are with every hostage still held in Gaza, with those who returned home traumatized, with those who perished in captivity, and those whose fate remains unknown. We once again demand their immediate, unconditional, safe, and dignified release. They must be released now. It is deeply troubling that these hostages have not been granted humanitarian access to address urgent medical and basic needs as required under international law, including international humanitarian and human rights law. Mr. President, in the months that have followed the appalling events of October 7, the members of the Security Council have been discussing and debating over the situation in the Middle East and specifically in the Gaza Strip as events unfolded and a disastrous humanitarian situation took hold of the entire Strip. The world has witnessed violence surging and people agonizing over the future of their loved ones. It has witnessed starvation and death. Unfortunately, as we continue to discuss the humanitarian situation in Gaza, a feeling of frustration, of a peace that remains elusive, is ever prevalent. We have repeatedly condemned the atrocities of October 7. We have made clear that Hamas has no place in the day after in Gaza. We have called for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. We have joined the calls of our fellow members of this Council for a ceasefire and for humanitarian aid to be delivered massively, immediately to Gaza. We have called on Israel to lift the blockade and spare the starving population. Mr. President, we cannot accept the suffering and humiliation of the hostages at the hands of Hamas and the anguish of their families. No one should. Nor can we turn a blind eye to the suffering of over 2 million Palestinians and their strive to survive. The toll is staggering: thousands dead or injured, countless displaced, and a population struggling daily for survival. In this regard, we call on all parties to show responsibility and opt for an agreement, as it is evident by now that this conflict has no military solution. The political process must be revitalized with the aim to create conditions conducive to achieving a two-state solution according to the relevant Security Council resolutions, while guaranteeing the right of Israel to exist in peace and security. As we have stressed before, there can be no day-after scenario for the Gaza Strip with Hamas. There can be no day-after scenario without the Palestinians in Gaza. Forced displacement of the population from the occupied Palestinian territories would amount to a grave violation of international law, would jeopardize the regional stability and security, and would undermine the prospect of a two-state solution, as would any other actions that run counter to this objective. Meanwhile, the humanitarian crisis on the ground demands immediate action. Millions are in urgent need of food, primary health services, education, and shelter. Border crossings must remain open. UNRWA's role should not be undermined. Civilians and humanitarian workers must be protected in line with international humanitarian law. Mr. President, we cannot change the past, but we can certainly shape the future. The suffering of both sides must come to an end. Neither the hostages and their families nor the Palestinians can afford another day of this devastation. I thank you.
Agradezco.
I thank the representative of Greece for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Mr. President, this meeting provides yet another opportunity for the Council to respond to the multifaceted catastrophe unfolding in Gaza. I acknowledge the participation in today's meeting of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Israel, His Excellency Gideon Sa'ar, the Permanent Observer of the Observer State of Palestine, His Excellency Riyad Mansour, and the representative of Argentina. I thank Assistant Secretary General Yencha for the updates and Mr. Eli David for his bravery in sharing his story with the world. No one should be forced to experience any of the horrors taking place in Gaza, and Guyana commiserates with Mr. David and his family. Indeed, Mr. David's account reminds us of the wanton degradation of human life that has persisted since October 7th, and even before. This must be utterly rejected by the international community and brought to an end. Mr. President, the October 7th attacks have triggered, arguably, a season of unprecedented suffering for Palestinians and Israelis alike, occasioning one of the deadliest days in Israel's history, and perhaps the deadliest period in Palestinian history. Guyana reiterates its condemnation of the October 7th attacks on Israel, as well as the disproportionate response by the Israeli Defense Force and the collective punishment inflicted on Palestinians, which continues today, almost 2 years later. The urgency of a ceasefire and of the need for a resolution of the present crisis cannot be overstated. We support the efforts of Egypt, Qatar, and the United States to that end. A comprehensive response is required that addresses all elements of the situation. Compliance with international law, including international humanitarian law and international human rights law, is central to an ultimate durable solution. In this context, Guyana reiterates its unequivocal call for the unconditional release of the remaining hostages, in keeping with resolutions adopted by this Council, as well as its condemnation of the continued captivity of Israeli and other nationals in Gaza. The taking of hostages is a violation of international law, as stipulated in Common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions, and should not be used as a bargaining chip to extract concessions. Perpetrators of this crime must, therefore, be held accountable. Additionally, Guyana calls for the prompt removal by Israel of ongoing restrictions on and impediments to the delivery of humanitarian aid at scale throughout Gaza, which have led to famine, disease, and death throughout Gaza. This Council should not countenance the denial of critical relief for human suffering under any pretext. It would be an abomination for the international community to continue to allow innocent people, least of all innocent children, to starve while in the sight of food. This Council has a duty to act urgently and collectively to bring this war to an end and to hold all parties accountable for violations that have ensued. Further, the ongoing displacement of Palestinians, both in Gaza and the occupied West Bank, must also be urgently addressed in recognition of the inalienable rights of Palestinians to a homeland and of the imperatives of a just and lasting peace, and having regard to relevant decisions of the International Court of Justice. The international community should spare no effort to safeguard the prospects of a viable two-state solution, as mandated by the relevant United Nations resolutions, including an end to the occupation of Palestinian lands. The two-state solution remains the essential core of a just and lasting peace between Israelis and Palestinians and the broader Middle East. Mr. President, in closing, Guyana underscores that collective political will makes all the difference. Hence, at this nadir of the war in Gaza, as we witness the worst of inhumanity inflicted on Gazans, we, this Council, must muster the collective political will to act decisively, comprehensively, and effectively. We must begin with a demand for immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire in Gaza, for an end to the violence in the occupied West Bank, for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, for an end to the humanitarian siege in Gaza, for the release of all Palestinians arbitrarily detained in Israel, and action to bring about a just, permanent, and comprehensive resolution of the Palestinian question. This is the only way to ensure true peace and security for Israel and for all its neighbors. I thank you.
Agradezco.
I thank the representative of Guyana for the statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of the Republic of Panama. Excellencies, colleagues, Panama would like to thank Mr. Miroslav Jenča, Assistant Secretary General for Europe, Central Asia and Americas, for his briefing. We reiterate our support for the work carried out by United Nations agencies within their serious limitations in an extremely challenging environment in Gaza. We welcome the presence of His Excellency the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Israel, as well as the representative of the Observer State of Palestine and the representative of Argentina, who honor us today with their participation. Panama extends special recognition to Mr. Eli David, the brother of Eviatar David, one of the hostages still held in captivity, who also honors us today with his presence. We value his bravery in raising his voice on behalf of his family and on behalf of so many others who continue to live in the anguish of waiting for their loved ones. To you and to all of the families of the hostages, Panama conveys its solidarity and respect. Panama has repeatedly expressed its deep concern over the catastrophic situation faced by the entire suffering population currently in the Gaza Strip. The sad reality endured by the hostages since the inhumane attacks on the 7th of October, of which it is estimated that at least 50 individuals remain in captivity, and around 20 of whom are believed to be alive, continues after 669 days still in the hands of Hamas. This constitutes an extreme manifestation of deliberate cruelty, which we have strongly condemned in this chamber and which we today condemn once again. The actions of Hamas towards the hostages, including the deprivation of food, prolonged isolation, the sadistic use of these as instruments of pressure and propaganda, and even the forced dissemination of videos, amount to a calculated attempt to break their will and to intimidate. They represent a violation of international humanitarian law. The recent harrowing images of Rom Braslavsky and Evyatar David are not merely reflections of individual tragedy, they are irrefutable evidence of the degrading, cruel and intolerable treatment to which Hamas has subjected all hostages for nearly 2 years, evoking painful memories of a history that should never have been repeated. Panama once again demands the immediate, dignified and unconditional release of all hostages. The suffering of the kidnapped hostages coexists with the daily tragedy of the Palestinian civilian population in Gaza. All individuals in the Strip are bearing the consequences of Hamas's extremist and deliberately cruel actions, having chosen to inflict pain rather than seek solutions. Gaza's future should be free from Hamas and its extremist actions. Millions of Palestinian civilians, mainly women, children, and the elderly, are facing acute food insecurity, thirst, disease, and forced displacement. Panama is not indifferent to this prolonged suffering, which represents a lamentable manifestation of dehumanization. We recognize the fortitude with which so many people have endured amidst destruction and despair, clinging to the remnants of humanity in an environment that no human being should have to endure. In the face of an unprecedented man-made humanitarian tragedy, alleviating the suffering of the civilian population in Gaza has become an urgent moral duty that calls upon us all equally. We urge that vital resources should reach those who need them most. Therefore, Panama insists that every humanitarian effort must be made to complement and strengthen existing humanitarian mechanisms. The United Nations agencies operating on the ground, alongside other humanitarian partners, represent an essential resource in the international response. Excellencies, colleagues, the days during which the truce, albeit fragile, was in effect, demonstrated that it is possible to make progress both in terms of humanitarian assistance and in the return of those who were deprived of their liberty. That brief respite reminded us that there is still some room for humanity. In this regard, Panama reiterates its urgent call for the re-establishment of an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, so as to halt the human suffering faced by all, to facilitate the sustained, unrestricted and adequate entry of vital humanitarian aid, and to ensure the immediate, dignified and unconditional release of all hostages still held by Hamas, whose acts of cruelty and drama have escalated with the treatment inflicted upon hostages Braslavsky and David. It's time to give restraint a chance, to allow for dialogue, and to uphold human dignity as a fundamental principle of coexistence upon which peace is built. Thank you very much.
Vuelvo a asumir.
I resume my functions as President of the Council. And I now give the floor to the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President, and our warm congratulations to Panama on assuming the presidency of the Security Council. Mr. President, I thank Assistant Secretary General Yancha for his briefing, and I acknowledge the testimony of Eli David and the distressing, unacceptable video of his brother digging his own grave. We reject all inhumane and degrading treatment against anyone, especially persons held in captivity. From day one, calls for a ceasefire have been launched by the Palestinian people in Gaza, and the families of hostages echoed across the world. Both were actually aware that this war would mean more death and agony for their loved ones. And I'm grateful for all of my colleagues, members of the Security Council, who have stressed the need for an immediate, continuous ceasefire. It saves lives. It releases hostages and Palestinian prisoners. It saves lives. It opens the doors and the crossings for humanitarian assistance. Stop the starvation of our people. It allows for the reconstruction of Gaza. It gives peace a possible chance. It gives all of us hope. I am very grateful for all of you who have stressed on these fundamental principles, and it is in your hands, since you are entrusted by the Charter of the UN to maintain international peace and security, to succeed in implementing your resolutions, and above all, to succeed in beginning with having an immediate ceasefire. Our call remains unchanged nearly 670 days later. End this Israeli war of massacres and starvation against our people. Release the hostages and prisoners. Enable immediate, unimpeded humanitarian aid to Gaza, including by the UN humanitarian system, including UNRWA, and secure full Israeli withdrawal from Gaza so that the Palestinian government can assume sole governance and security responsibilities with regional and international support, and we can begin immediately the recovery and reconstruction process based on the internationally endorsed Arab OIC plan and move towards finally ending this illegal occupation and achieving a just peace. Yet, in direct contradiction with the calls of Israeli hostages' families and by hundreds of former Israeli military leaders, what is Israel's answer to this worldwide call? Let's occupy all of Gaza. Let's annex Palestinian land. Let's displace the Palestinian people. Mr. President, the Israeli representative sent a letter calling on the Security Council to address violations of international law that need to be condemned. Speaking of abhorrent massacres of innocent civilians, of people being starved, tortured, and treated inhumanely, of how they appear emaciated, victims of starvation and abuse, not once realizing how much this description matches his own government's actions against an entire civilian population, the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip. And he concluded his letter saying, and I quote, "One must wonder who is really being starved in Gaza," end of quotation. A despicable denial of what is evident for all the world to see, and trying once again to use the plight of Israelis held captive to cover his government's crimes or to justify them. Mr. President, Israel is demanding the world to take a stance against starvation when it is actually starving an entire civilian population, when it is shooting at them while they seek water and food, with the most severe effects on the most vulnerable, with infants and children dying, and with those surviving facing untold pain and trauma. It is demanding that the world take a stance against conditions of captivity of Israelis when it is holding 2 million people captive under its deadly siege, when 76 Palestinian prisoners have died under torture or starving or due to medical neglect in the last 20 months alone, when there are videos of Israeli jailers raping, beating, and humiliating Palestinian prisoners, when the world has seen the images of hundreds of Palestinians arrested, men and boys, placed almost naked on trucks and taken away, several of them having disappeared since, when 10,000 Palestinians languish in Israeli jails, thousands of them under administrative detention, the most arbitrary form of detention, when hundreds of our children remain detained, when Israel has held prisoners over 1 million Palestinians since the onset of the occupation 58 years ago, when it has held the remains of Palestinians for years and decades. Mr. President, the killing of civilians is unacceptable in all circumstances. Let me repeat. The killing of civilians, all civilians, is unacceptable in all circumstances. The killing of children is unacceptable in all circumstances. We should not tolerate harming or killing a single child regardless of what nationality or faith they adhere to. Those who need to ask what is the nationality or faith of the perpetrator and of the victim to decide if you are outraged or not should go check their humanity. Torture and ill treatment of those held captive are unacceptable under any circumstances. It cannot be justified in some cases and condemned in others. Israel says the videos of Ron and Abiyatar are unacceptable means of pressure, and they are, just as when it has abducted thousands of civilians as bargaining chips, and when it is starving millions of civilians as a method of pressure, as its leaders have confessed before finding a new narrative given the international outcry. Mr. President, when Israel says this is a war of civilization against barbarism, it means that its barbaric acts have to be condoned because the perpetrators are Israelis and the victims are Palestinians. It does not even see the irony of it, resorting to such images that have been used and abused by colonial powers who claimed to represent civilization against barbarism to justify their atrocities. That is why Israel's foreign minister fails to grasp how his moral lessons to the rest of the world, scolding his closest allies, explaining that they should act according to his own very peculiar view of the law and humanity, sound totally tone deaf, are a source of worldwide contempt for him and his government. But as we reject selective outrage, we should not practice it ourselves. We oppose and reject all attacks against civilians, whether Palestinians or Israelis. There is nothing that justifies harming civilians or those no longer taking part in hostilities. You cannot justify it by calling them terrorists, and you cannot justify it by saying they are occupiers. The rules of international law must be upheld by all and for all to preserve our shared humanity. Mr. President, allow me to address the Israeli people. Your government wants you to believe that the whole world is conspiring against you, that the Palestinian people are terrorists, that the UN is filled with terrorists and terrorist supporters, that your closest allies are your enemies. This most radical Israeli government and its foreign minister are calling for, and I quote, de-radicalization, end of quotation, of the Palestinian society as a whole, calling them, and I quote, human animals, and quote, children of darkness. They want you to believe that your survival depends on your ability to continuously wage wars, including against a defenseless civilian population, half of whom are children in their erasure. 1 million Palestinian children in the Gaza Strip. The Israeli people need to decide if this is what they want their government and military doing. These atrocities that the whole world is watching and that your government is hoping you will filter out, deny, or justify. In the midst of this genocide, we are telling you, you choose peace and appeal to you. We choose peace and appeal to you to do the same. We do it for our children and our people. You should do it for your children and your loved ones. Enough bloodshed, enough wars, enough suffering, enough occupation. Enough bloodshed, enough wars, enough suffering, enough occupation. We are clear. What Israel did before the 7th of October cannot justify harming Israeli civilians on the 7th of October. And what Hamas did on the 7th of October cannot justify harming Palestinian civilians ever since. There is no justification for the killing of over 60,000 Palestinians, including nearly 20,000 children, the maiming of 200,000 Palestinians, the forced displacement and starvation of 2 million Palestinians, and the total destruction of Gaza. As there is no justification for the killing of more than 1,000 Palestinians in the West Bank in attacks by Israeli occupation forces and Israeli settler terrorists, or for the forced displacement of 40,000 Palestinians and destructions of their homes and refugee camps. The Israeli government is promising you that the solution is more occupation, more oppression, more displacement, more colonization, more killing, a recipe that has failed for 8 decades. Do not believe them. Do not believe them. If not for the Palestinian people's sake, for your own. If not in the name of humanity, in the name of self-preservation. The solution is ending this illegal occupation and ending this disastrous conflict. It is the realization of the independence and sovereignty of the Palestinian state, not its destruction. It is the fulfillment of our rights, not their continued denial. It is respect for international law, not its trampling. It is the implementation of the two-state solution, not a one-state reality with Palestinians condemned to genocide, ethnic cleansing, or apartheid. Mr. President, the international conference co-chaired by Saudi Arabia and France and attended by around 185 states with the active participation of 120 of them, has charted an irreversible path to peace. In the midst of all these tragedies, and the pain that we all endured. The international conference sent a clear message. There is an alternative way. There is an alternative way. All of you who participated in the conference and deliberated the outcome document and the annex, you made a loud and clear statement. There is an alternative way. There is a possibility of peace. Palestinians are not destined to forever endure occupation, displacement, and dispossession. And Palestinians and Israelis are not doomed to be at eternal war. By ending complicity and advancing compliance, by ending impunity, upholding accountability, by breaking the cycle of violence instead of fueling it, by rejecting violence instead of justifying them, by implementing the two-state solution instead of watching it to be destroyed, are the only alternative. Perpetual conflict is the only alternative is perpetual conflict. The conference identified the required actions by the parties and the states around the world in line with international law, the relevant UN resolutions and the ICJ 2024 landmark advisory opinion to achieve just and lasting peace that will lead to regional integration and security. Palestine endorsed the International Conference Declaration and Annex, while Israel boycotted it. Mr. President, there are only two parties who link the latest wave of recognition of the State of Palestine to the 7th of October against facts and reason. The Israeli government, in order to deter Western governments from such recognition, and Hamas in order to take credit for it. The reality is that more countries are recognizing the State of Palestine in support of its enduring commitment to liberation through peaceful means. As reaffirmed yet again in President Abbas' letter to President Macron and Crown Prince bin Salman, in support of the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people to self-determination, in support of the two-state solution that requires an independent and sovereign Palestinian state, and yes, also in response to Israel's attempts to destroy that state through the destruction of Gaza and the colonization of the West Bank, through the forced transfer of our people and the annexation of our land. Such recognition is thus in support of our rights and of peace. I repeat, our rights, the Palestinian rights, and of peace, of an independent Palestine living side by side in peace and security with Israel based on the relevant UN resolutions. But since this Israeli government does not want peace, opposes a Palestinian state and the two-state solution, its opposition to such recognition is expected, and using argument such that supporting the two-state solution is supporting terror is also expected, regardless how absurd such a claim is. Peace starts with ending the war in Gaza. Let me repeat, peace starts with ending the war in Gaza. Peace will prevail once Palestinian rights are fulfilled and the Palestinian state is independent. We are ready to work with the US administration, Saudi Arabia, which showed leadership for Palestinian rights and peace, France, which made the right, courageous decision to recognize the state of Palestine and all countries who wish to see freedom, justice, and peace prevail, to finally achieve what some want us to believe is impossible. Peace in the Middle East, it's not impossible. We have to work for it. It is the only alternative to war, to destruction, to hostages, to prisoners, to pain, to death, to starvation. Which one is nicer? Peace is much nicer than war and destruction. Peace saves lives, release hostages, release prisoners, give our children and their children hope. Peace is what the world wants. Peace is the business of the Security Council to make sure that the maintenance of international peace and security. That is the alternative. For those who think there is no alternative, no, war is not the alternative. Peace is the alternative. A peace for all peoples and all states. A peace that can unleash the unbelievable potential of this region. A peace that saves lives today and achieves shared peace, security, and prosperity tomorrow. The time we waste is measured in human lives, and we are out of time. This Council and the international community as a whole have a duty to act, and to act now. Not a single minute more should be wasted. Thank you, Mr. President.
Agradezco.
I thank the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine for the statement. I now give the floor to the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the State of Israel, His Excellency Mr. Gideon Saar. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. We heard the heartbreaking testimony of Eli, brother of the hostage Eviatar David, starved by Hamas. I want to thank the US and other countries for answering our call. Thank you for convening this urgent and important meeting of the UN Security Council. But we also heard here so many lies. I cannot refer to them all, but it was really funny to hear Russian Federation representative after 3.5 years of a brutal invasion and brutal war in Ukraine and bombardments on civilian population in Kiev and other places, speaking here the way he spoke. I also heard the Palestinian representative. I must say the Palestinians learned propaganda from you, from the Soviet era, and you were good teachers. The Palestinians invented terrorism as a way to promote their means, and it includes all Palestinian fractions. And until this very day, the Palestinian Authority continued to pay salaries to terrorists and terrorist families accordingly to the crime the terrorists committed. And this is how they encourage terrorism until this very day. You spoke about peace. From 1947, you had countless opportunities to reach peace. You rejected them all. I come here today as the Foreign Minister of the State of Israel, the sovereign state of the Jewish people, fighting for its existence for almost 2 years on 7 different fronts. I'm here today because our hostages are still there, starved, tortured by Hamas and Islamic Jihad in the dungeons of Gaza. On October 7th, Hamas invaded, with no reason, into Israel. It committed evil crimes like the Nazis and ISIS did. They murdered and raped women, killed children in front of their parents, and parents in front of their children. They beheaded people, burned whole families alive, took 251 hostages into cruel captivity, 50 of them are still there, starved and tortured. I want to read from the Dina Project report. This report describes Hamas' sickening sexual crimes and atrocities committed on October 7th. And since then, bodies were found with objects inserted into their private parts. Bodies of naked women were found cuffed onto trees. Bodies were found with signs of genital mutilation. Most of the sexually assaulted women were among the 1,166 murdered of that day. After they were raped, they were murdered. They are forever silenced. But sexual violence continued for those taken in captivity. Amit Susana was released from Hamas' cruel captivity. She described bravely how she was forced at gunpoint to commit a sexual act on her capture. This is the pure evil that Israel faces. Hamas crimes are still ongoing. This past weekend, the whole world witnessed the cruel starvation of Eviatar David and Ron Braslavsky, tortured at the hands of Hamas and Islamic Jihad. The world saw their terrible condition, bones standing out in their skin like living skeletons, looking death in their eye. Eviatar was forced to dig his own grave. You just heard his brother, Eli. Hamas and Islamic Jihad used the starvation and torture of hostages as evil tools. It's part of a deliberate and well-planned sadistic propaganda campaign. Its goals: 1, psychological terror. 2nd, an attempt to create a link between our starved hostages and their blood libel against Israel. But it's a campaign of lies. Israel facilitated huge amounts of aid into Gaza since the beginning of the war, in an unprecedented way in the history of wars. And by the way, the quantities are growing every day, if you follow that. Yet it is still accused of starvation. But the truth must be told. Hamas sadistically starves our hostages while the terrorists enjoy meat, fish, and vegetables. And we saw the brother of Eviatar demonstrated that with the photo of the well-fed terrorist with Eviatar in his terrible condition. And you all saw the thick, meaty arm of the well-fed terrorist next to Eviatar, the living skeleton forced to dig his own grave. We facilitating huge amounts of aid into Gaza. No other country acts this way in war, on such a large scale, under such difficult circumstances. But Hamas loots the aid and uses it as a financial tool. We hadn't heard a word about that from the Palestinian representative. The distorted Hamas terrorists cruelly decide if and what the hostages will eat, mainly what they will not eat. Eviatar spoke of entire days when he did not eat at all. Our sick and starved hostages still have not seen representatives of the Red Cross until today, despite this being explicitly agreed upon in the hostage deal in November 2023. The medicine they desperately need to survive has not reached them. While the terrorists, the murderers being held in Israeli prisons, receive medical care and nutrition, Hamas and Islamic Jihad torture our hostages. terrorist states and organizations kidnapping civilians is not just our problem. But Hamas did it on a huge scale on October 7th. These terrorist states and organizations do so in order to ensure their own survival and interests. Terrorists inhumanely kidnap innocent civilians as tools to achieve their goals. In the case of Hamas, they try to force upon us their conditions remaining in power in Gaza. And don't illude yourself. They don't care that someone else will take responsibility on civilian issues, taking care of the ruins they left behind in Gaza. They want to stay the strongest military force to continue their war against Israel and its civilians. This dangerous phenomenon could happen tomorrow anywhere in the world. The world must put an end to the kidnapping of civilians. The international community must take it not worthwhile for the terrorists. Today it's Israel, tomorrow it's you. The world has been turned upside down. While Hamas ran its propaganda machine, a huge part of the international media is both ignoring the truth and buying its lies. I read the New York Times the day after Hamas released the distorted video of Eviatar David. I looked, but could not find Eviatar on the front page. And then I couldn't find his picture in all of the paper. I call on the international media. Put Eviatar and Rome front and center. Is this not newsworthy? We are witnessing an upside-down world. We are witnessing the twisted anti-Israeli agenda of so much of the global media. They shift the responsibility from the kidnappers and rapists to the attacked country. They shift the blame from terrorists to the victims. Instead of standing by Israel, you are blaming the victims of an attack from 7 different fronts. And I ask here at the United Nations Security Council, do you know what Secretary General Guterres tweeted after the horrible images of Eviatar and Rome were released? Not a word. Deafening silence. Yet we all see his endless and obsessive tweets against Israel, time and again. Ladies and gentlemen, what we are witnessing today is the rise of psychotic anti-Semitism around the world, flamed by modern blood libels like darkest days in history. Jews are hunted around the world simply because they are Jews. In Melbourne, in Amsterdam, in Paris. But it is not the only war on earth, but it's the only case. People are being hunted everywhere because of their nationality. Do you know of another nation fighting for its life and suffering around the world from hostility and violence? We are living in an upside-down world, a world in which Israel is put on a bench of the accused while it fights for its survival. There is a name for it. It's called anti-Semitism. 80 years after the end of the Holocaust, anti-Semitism is having its golden age once again. There are countries that acted, even in this building, to pressure Israel instead of Hamas during sensitive days in the negotiations. They directly contributed to the assassination of the chances to reach a hostage deal and ceasefire. They prolonged this war. This is what they did. So now let us ask the simplest questions. Who initiated the war on October 7th? Who is responsible for its continuation, for the endless suffering? There is only one clear answer: Hamas. Hamas invaded Israel and committed the October 7 atrocities. Hamas still refuses to release the starving hostages from its dungeons. Hamas still refuses to lay down its arms. The call on Hamas to release our hostages must be front and center on the world stage. It must not stop until they are all come home. Mr. President, we call for the immediate and unconditional release of our hostages. We call on the UN Security Council to finally condemn Hamas for its evil crimes, to hold it responsible, and to demand the immediate release of all our hostages. Thank you.
Agradezco.
I thank His Excellency Minister Saar for the statement. And I now give the floor to the representative of Argentina. You have the floor. Good afternoon to you all. Greetings to all of our colleagues and also to Mr. Miroslav Jenča, as well as the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Gideon Saar. Allow me also, Mr. President, to express my country's congratulations to Panama for taking up the Council's presidency for the month of August. We wish you every success in such a lofty role. Mr. President, my delegation requested to take the floor today before this Council to clearly and firmly demand the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages still held by Hamas. The Republic of Argentina has always condemned terrorism in all of its forms and manifestations, and we do so not only due to our profound moral conviction, but also due to our own painful experience of having been victims of two attacks that shook our people: the 1992 attack on the Israeli embassy and the 1994 attack on the Amir headquarters. We know the harm that terrorism wreaks, and it is marked in our national memory. The heinous attack on the 7th of October in Israel was not just another incident, it was an expression of planned cruelty, an act of terrorism of unprecedented brutality, which claimed the lives of Argentine nationals and saw the kidnapping of more than 20 Argentinians, including many children, such as Kfir Bibas, who was just 9 months old and who was then massacred in the tunnels in Gaza. We continue to demand the unconditional and immediate return of the 4 Argentinians still in captivity: Eitan Horn, Ariel Cunio, David Cunio, and the body of Lior Rudeev, as well as all of the hostages still held by the terrorist organization Hamas. Mr. President, the situation of the hostages is essentially a humanitarian question. It is unacceptable that they remain deprived of their freedom. They have now spent 669 days in conditions that we've seen reflected in videos that have been recently circulated, pawns in a game of perverse media terrorism, the only aim of which is to continue sowing anguish among the victims of the hostages, as we have heard today from Eli David today. What we've seen over these 20 months through images and testimonies are acts of torture. There's no possible justification for such barbarity and anti-Semitism. The silence and indifference are not an option. The international community cannot allow horror to become normalized, nor for those who are responsible to go unpunished. The Argentine demand for the release of the hostages remains as strong as it was at the outset of the terrorist attack. Our commitment is unwavering to the families of those who have lost their lives, to those who have managed to return, and to those who remain in the hands of Hamas. We will not cease in speaking out until all of the hostages have been returned home. Thank you very much.
Agradezco al representante.
I thank the representative of Argentina for the statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.